Hey guys, this is Awesome Coder. So in today's video we're going to create a clone of the classic arcade game Pong using a Python game development library known as Pygame. So allow me to show you the finished version of the game. Here as you can see I can move the paddles using keyboard input. We can deflect the ball using these paddles. We also keep track of the score for both paddles. So yeah, it is going to be a fun project to build while learning the Pygame. So let's start building the game. But guys, before that here I want to ask something from you. As you guys know that I'm a new YouTuber. After uploading first 3 videos, I have only got 2 subscribers. Of course I'm providing quality content here. And I'll keep improving on it, I promise that. As it really takes a lot of effort to produce these videos. That's why I'm asking you to please subscribe to my channel Awesome Coder. It is absolutely free to subscribe. You just have to press this subscribe button here. So for this video let's have a target of 10 subscribers. I'm going to upload the next video after we have a family of 10 subscribers. Thank you for your patience. Now let's start coding our game. So now I'm inside my VS Code. And I've already opened up a folder named Pong. Now let's first of all create our main.py file. First I'll import Pygame. Now first of all we've to initialize the Pygame. So I'll say pygame.init. Now we also need to deinitialize the Pygame. So I'll call pygame.quit. Now no matter what kind of game you make, whenever you're using Pygame you've to write these 2 lines of code. Now we're ready to create our window. So here define a variable. Name it window, and assign the value of pygame.display.set_mode to it. Now this setMode function actually creates a new window for us. And we have to provide window size to it, as you can see here. Let's define the window size constants above. So I'll create a window width constant and assign 800 to it. And next I'll create a window height constant and assign 600 to it. Now let's provide these values to setMode function. Here I'll include 2 parentheses. Because setMode function takes in window size as a tuple of 2 integer values. And inside here I'll simply pass in window width and window height constants that we created above. Now our window should be 800 wide by 600 tall. Let's run the program. Here in terminal I'll type python main.py. Hit enter. Okay, wait a minute. We definitely saw the window pop up, but then it actually closed instantly. So you would be asking why's that? Well, in Pygame to actually keep the window running, we have to do some work here. So let's first of all create our game loop here. Which is going to be an infinite while loop. So first I'll create a Boolean variable, more appropriately named is_active. And make it true. Now let's say, while is active. Now as long as this is_active variable is going to be true, this while loop is going to run. And inside here we actually need to check for the Pygame events. Like when the mouse buttons are clicked or a key on the keyboard is pressed. So here type for event in pygame.event.get. And this event.get function returns a list of event objects. As you can see here. And we're iterating on these events. Now here we'll check if the user has pressed the close button on the window. So for that we'll say if event.type is equal to pygame.quit event. Notice the quit is uppercase here. And if the user has pressed the close button, we'll simply set is_active to false. And doing that will get us out of the game loop. And then this Pygame quit function is going to be called. The effect of which is that our window is going to be closed successfully. Run the program. And voila, now our window is not closing automatically. Let's try to close it by pressing the close button. Cool, the window closes successfully. Now let's run the program again. Now we need to change the title of our window, As you can see by default the title is Pygame window, and we obviously don't want that. So it is actually very easy to change the title. Here after creating the window, we'll call pygame.display.set_caption. Pygame likes to call the title as caption. Now here we'll provide the name of our game, which is Pong, as a string. Run the game. Perfect, our window's title has changed just like that. Close the window. Now we need to change the background color of the window to dark gray color, as you saw in the finished version of the game. So for that, let's declare color constants up here. So I'll create a variable, name it dark gray, and assign to it a tuple of 3 integer values. 24, 24 and 24. Next let's create the constant named white and assign to it the tuple of RGB values for white color. Now here in our game loop, we'll say window.fill and provide the white color. Now this window.fill method is going to color the whole window to white. Let's run the program. Okay, we can clearly see that our window's background color hasn't changed to white. But why is that? Well, we actually need to tell the window to update itself every frame or iteration of the while loop. So as the last line of the code in our game loop, type pygame.display.flip. Now run the game. Now the background color has changed to white. But as you saw in the finished product, we want our background color to be dark grayish. The reason behind changing the background color to white in the first place was that I wanted to make it more noticeable this way. Now in the fill method, instead of white, pass in dark gray. Run the game. Cool, I love this background color. Now we can start creating our paddles. First I'll create the left paddle, which I'll call paddle A. So create a variable named paddle_a. And it is going to be a new pygame.rect object. Now a rect object has many useful properties and methods that we can use to simplify our code. Now rect object's constructor expects 4 values from us. Namely the left, top, width and the height. We'll provide 0, 0 for the left and top. And we'll provide paddle width and paddle height here. Now we haven't defined these paddle width and paddle height constants. So let's do just that. So up here we'll say paddle width is going to be 10 pixels. And paddle height is going to be 80. Now let's draw this paddle A to the screen. So here I'll say pygame.draw.rect. Because our paddle is basically a rectangle. And pass in our window object to it. Next pass in the color you want your paddle to be. We'll pass in the white color that we created earlier. And as a last argument we'll have to pass in the rect object, which is our paddle A. Now run the game. And our paddle is drawn here at the top left of the window. We want to position it vertically in the middle. So here I'll say paddle A.center Y, and assign the half window height to it. Now you must know that Y deals with the vertical axis. And dividing the window height by half is simply a way to get the window's center point in the vertical direction. And then we're assigning that value to this center Y property. And keep in mind that this center Y property comes with the rect object, we're not creating it here. But we're simply assigning to it. Now run the game. Okay, so now our paddle has positioned itself vertically in the center. Now let's make a small optimization here. Instead of dividing this window height by 2, we can actually multiply it by 0.5, which is mathematically the same as dividing by 2. But multiplication is actually a little less expensive than division operation. So yeah, a pro tip. That whenever you see a division operation in your program, if possible try to replace it with a multiplication equivalent. Run the game. And as you can see, it is working the same as before. Now let's actually offset the paddle a little bit in the x-axis. because as of now you can see the paddle is just stuck at the leftmost edge of the screen. So here first of all create the constant named paddle offset x, and assign the value of 20 to it. We're creating a variable because we'll use it again for the paddle b. Now above this paddle a.center y line, type paddle a.left, which is again a convenience property provided by the rect object. And we'll assign the value of the paddle offset x to it. Now our paddle should be offset 20 pixels from the left edge of the window. Run the game. Great, now the paddle is positioned more correct, if you ask me. Now let's create the second paddle or paddle b. So copy the code for the paddle a. And paste it here. Here change the name of the variable from paddle a to paddle b. And here change paddle b.left to paddle b.right. And here where we draw our paddle a, duplicate that line. And instead of paddle a put in paddle b. Run the game. Okay, our paddle b is being drawn. But it is being drawn next to paddle a. That's why it is appearing as if there is only one fat paddle. But actually there are two. We need the paddle b to be drawn near the right edge of the window. So here I'll say, paddle b's right edge should be at screen width minus paddle offset x, instead of paddle offset x. Run the game. And voila, our paddle b is being drawn at the correct position. Now we need to move our paddles with keyboard input. But first I'll create an FPS controller. So I'll create a variable, name it FPS_controller, and assign it a new Pygame.time.clock object. Now using this FPS controller we can control how many times this game loop is going to run. Because as of now this game loop is going to run according to your computer's capacity. Maybe on my computer it can run 10,000 times a second, or 100 times a second on some other low-end PC. We need to be sure that this while loop runs 60 times or frames a second. For that here is the very last line in our game loop. I'll say FPS_controller.tick. And pass in the value stored in the FPS constant that we are going to define up here. So I'll say assign 60 to the FPS constant. Now our game is going to run 60 frames per second. Now first let's implement the movement for the paddle a. So first of all I'll create a constant up here. Name it paddle_speed. Assign to it an integer value of 6. Now we'll use this paddle speed constant for both of our paddles, that's why I'm defining it up here. Here, when we're creating paddle a, I'll create a variable, name it paddle_a_velocity. Now using this velocity we'll be able to move our paddle a. For now let's set it to 0. Come here in the while loop. And before window.fill, we'll say paddle a.y plus equals paddle a_velocity. So here every frame of the game loop, we're adding our velocity to the paddle a's y position. And recall that y position deals with the vertical axis. So doing just that will move our paddle a vertically. Let's run the game. Well, our paddle a is not moving vertically, because we have set our velocity to 0. If for example I set paddle a's velocity to paddle_speed, our paddle a is going to move in the bottom direction. And let me comment this FPS controller.tick line of the code, so that we can see what is the need of this FPS controller here. Run the game. Wow! As you saw our paddle moved so fast. Because on my computer the while loop is running many times a second. Maybe 1,000 times. So we're getting 1,000 frames a second. On other low-end PC it can be a different case. But our FPS controller here makes sure that our while loop runs 60 times a second. Now we can uncomment this FPS controller.tick. Run the game again. Now the movement is working fine. But our paddle is moving on its own. Of course, we want it to move when W or S keys are pressed. So first set this paddle A velocity back to 0. And let's make sure it isn't moving now. Yeah, that is the case. Now we'll change this velocity variable on user input. So here when we check for events. After this if check. I'll say else if event.type is equal to pygame.keydown. Notice keydown is written all uppercase. Now this pygame.keydown event is fired whenever any key on the keyboard is pressed. Inside here we want to check if the W key is pressed. So I'll say, if event.key is equal to pygame.k_w. Make sure that K is uppercase and W is lowercase. Here I'll subtract the paddle speed from the paddle A velocity. We're subtracting because in Pygame the up direction is negative, likewise the down direction is positive. And now we'll say, if event.key is equal to pygame.k_s. So if the S key is pressed, we'll do inverse of what we've done above. So I'll say paddle A dot velocity plus equals paddle_speed. Now we need to reset this velocity variable to 0. Whenever the key is not being pressed. Because if we run the game now, the paddle is going to move and it is not going to stop. So for that I'll duplicate this whole key down logic. And here instead of key down we'll say key up. Key up means whenever a key on the keyboard is released. And everything can remain the same. But only here we'll inverse the math operations. So instead of minus equals, I'll say plus equals. And instead of plus equals, I'll say minus equals. Run the game. Cool, now we can move the paddle using W or S key. And whenever we release the keys it stops moving. And of course this is the behavior we want. But the thing that we don't want here is this. Notice that I can actually move the paddle outside the visible bounds of the screen. So next let's fix that. So here after the paddle movement code, I'll write if paddle_A.top is less than 0. Which means if the paddle A got past the top edge of the window, then we're simply resetting it back to 0. Doing this will make sure that the paddle never moves outside the top edge. Let's test that. And yeah, no matter how hard I try the paddle can never move outside the top edge. But still we can move the paddle outside the bottom edge. So next let's fix that. So I'll write else if paddle_A dot bottom is greater than window height. Which means if the paddle is touching the bottom edge, then simply set paddle A dot bottom to window height. Run the game. And let's test both edges. Great, now our paddle A can't move outside the edges of the window. Now let's move this paddle A's movement code into its own function. In order to clean up the code a little. So I'll cut the code. And here I'll say handle paddle A update. We'll create this function up here. And inside this function paste the code for the paddle A movement. Now let's test if everything works as before. Good, as you can see the paddle movement is working fine. Now let's implement the movement for paddle B. So here I'll copy this paddle A velocity variable. Paste it here. And replace paddle A velocity with paddle B velocity. Here in the key down event. Duplicate these if checks for the paddle A movement. And replace K_W with K_up. Which means the up arrow key. And similarly do for the K_S. And write K_down. Which is going to run when the down arrow key is pressed. And in both if statements change paddle A velocity with paddle B velocity. And in key up event duplicate these two if statements. Again, instead of W key write K underscore up. And here write K underscore down. Replace paddle A velocity with paddle B velocity. And here duplicate this handle paddle A update function. And here change A to B. Now let's define this function. So up here, when we define paddle A update function, duplicate this paddle A update function. And change the name of the function to handle paddle B update. Inside this function change every instance of the paddle A with paddle B. Run the game. Cool, now we can control both paddles. Paddle A can be moved with W and S keys. Likewise, we can move paddle B with up and down arrow keys. And also both paddles can't move outside the visible bounds of the window. So now let's create our ball. First of all, here in game object constants, I'll create a constant, name it ball underscore size. And assign an integer value of 10 to it. Now here, after creating the paddle B, I'll create our ball object. So I'll write ball is equal to pygame.rect. And set 0 for the left, 0 for the top. And because our ball is going to be square, which means the width and the height is going to be same. That's why I'll put ball size for both width and the height. And here, after drawing both paddles, I'll draw our ball. So duplicate the line of code that draws paddle B. And here, instead of paddle B, pass in our ball object. Now run the game. Okay, our ball is drawing at the top left edge of the window, as you can see here. But we want to position the ball in the center of screen. So for that, here, after creating the ball, I'll set ball.center property to a tuple of half window width and half window height. Recall that multiplying by 0.5 is same as dividing by 2. Run the game. Cool, now our ball is positioned at the center of the screen. Next, let's implement the movement for the ball. So first, I'll create a new constant up here. I'll name it ball underscore speed. And assign a value of 5 to it. Next, here in the ball creation code, I'll create a new variable, name it ball underscore velocity underscore x. And assign to it the value of paddle speed. Duplicate this line and instead of x write y. Now, just like the paddles, we're going to move the ball by using these variables. So here, after calling the two functions for the paddles movement, we're going to write ball.x plus equals ball underscore velocity underscore x. Next, duplicate this line and change x to y in both places. Now our ball should be moving in the bottom right direction. Because recall that we're setting the x velocity and y velocity to positive paddle speed here. Let's run the game. And yeah, as you can see, our ball is moving in the bottom right direction. Next, we need the ball to bounce off the top and bottom edges. But before that, let's put this ball movement code into its own function. So up here, I'll define a function named handleBallUpdate. And paste the code for the ball movement. And one other thing we need to do is that inside this paddle B update function, in the comments change paddle A to paddle B. And before we forget, let's also invoke ball update function inside the game loop. Now we can run the game to test if our code still works. Yeah, everything works just as before. Now let's implement the bouncing off the walls logic for the ball. So inside ball update function, after moving the ball, I'll write if ball.top is less than 0. Which means if the ball is touching the top edge. Then let's set the ball.top back to 0. Just like we did for our paddles. And to actually bounce off the ball so that it moves in the other direction, we will multiply ball velocity y variable with -1. Multiplying a number with -1 will reverse that number, such if the number is positive it will become negative, and if the number is negative it will become positive. Now this is for bouncing off the top edge. Duplicate this if statement. And replace ball.top with ball.bottom. Instead of less than sign, put in greater than. And replace 0 with window height. And also here change top to bottom. And instead of 0 put in window height. And this line which reverses the velocity y can remain the same. Let's run the game. Why we're getting this error here? Let's try to understand what this error messages tells us. It says cannot access local variable ball velocity y. And we're getting this error because we're attempting to change this ball velocity y variable, which recall is a global variable. And in Python we cannot change a global variable inside a function. If we want to change a global variable inside a function, we have to explicitly tell the Python by writing at the very first line inside the ball update function. So we'll say global and then name of our variable, which is ball velocity y in this case. Now let's run the game. Now our ball is bouncing off the bottom edge. Let's quickly check if the ball also bounces off the top edge. So here when we define ball velocity y, set it to negative ball speed. Let's run the game. And the ball also bounces off the top edge. So code for bouncing off the edges is done. Next we need the ball to bounce off the paddles. But first let me fix a mistake that I've made. Here instead of the paddle speed we need to put in the ball speed. Let's run the game. Now the ball is moving more correctly. Now in the ball update function. After checking for the collision with the top and bottom edges, I'll write if ball.collide rect and pass in paddle A into it. Now this collide rect method is actually defined inside the Pygame.rect object which is also our ball. And it checks for the collision with another rect. Since our paddles are also rect objects, that's why I'm passing paddle A here. And I'll write or ball.collide rect and pass in paddle B. So the code inside this if statement is going to run whenever the ball collides with paddle A or paddle B. Here we simply multiply ball velocity x with -1, so that the ball reverses its x direction. Now since our velocity x is a global variable and we're changing the value of it here, we need to mention it up here. Otherwise we're going to get an error just like before. So after ball velocity y, I'll add a comma and write ball velocity x. Cool, now we can deflect the ball using our paddles. Next let's implement the scoring mechanics for our game. So now when we create our paddles here, I'll define a variable, paddle A, score. Set it to 0. Copy this variable. And paste it here. Replace paddle A, score with paddle B score. Now inside ball update function after checking for the collision with the paddles. First of all let's check if paddle A scores a point. And paddle A is going to score a point when the ball gets past the right paddle which is paddle B. So I'm going to say if ball.left is greater than window width. Which means when the ball's left edge gets past the right edge of the window. Which means the ball will be completely outside the right edge of the window. Then we'll increment the paddle A score by 1. And also we need to reset the ball back to the center. So I'll create a function, name it reset_ball. Copy this line of code that sets ball's position to the center of the screen. Put it inside resetBall function. And call that function here. Duplicate the if statement. Instead of if write elif. Change ball.left with ball.right. Change greater than to less than. Replace window width with 0. So now code inside this if statement is going to run when the ball gets past the left edge. Which means the paddle B is going to score a point. So change paddle A score to paddle B score. And since both score variables are global variables, we need to mention that up here. Let's run the game. And as you can see, the ball is resetting back to center whenever it gets past the left or right edges. And our score is also increasing. But of course we don't have a way to see that. So next let's actually display the paddle's score. So for that we actually need to create a font object. So up here, after creating the window, I'll create a variable. Name it score_font. And assign to it the new pygame.font.sys_font object. The constructor takes font's name as the first argument. We'll pass none. So Pygame will load the default font. And as a second argument we'll pass the size for our font. That is going to be 36 pixels. Now after drawing the game objects in the game loop, we'll draw our scores. First I'll draw paddle A, score. And to actually draw the text, we need to get the image of our score text from the score font object that we created above. So I'll type score_font.render. Here we'll pass in the text we want to render. So as f-string, I'll type A, then a space, then a colon. And then in curly braces our paddle A, score variable. The second argument is if we want anti-aliasing to be applied to our font. Anti-aliasing is actually going to make the text look more nice around the edges. So I'll type true. And as a last argument I'll pass in the color value of white. Now this score_font.render is actually returning a new image object. We need to store it in a variable. So create a variable named paddle A, score image. And assign to it the return value of score_font.render. Now we need to draw this image object to the window. So I'll type window.blit. Pass in our image object. As a second argument we need to pass in the position where we want our text to render. So it is going to be a tuple. We'll give an x value of 30. And y value of 20. Now the score is going to be displayed for our paddle A. Let's actually verify if it is true. So run the game. Yeah, as you can see the score is displaying for the paddle A. Let's miss the ball to see if the score increases. Yeah, the score increases. Next let's actually do the same thing for the paddle B score. So duplicate these two lines of code. And everywhere change A to B. And here in the X value, instead of 30 pass in window width -80. And now let's run the game. Cool, score for both paddles is displaying. And also notice if the paddle A misses the ball, then paddle B's score increases. And when the paddle B misses the ball, paddle A gets a point. Now before we call it a day, we have one last thing to fix. Here as you can see when this paddle misses the ball, and the ball resets back to center, the ball keeps coming towards the same direction. We want to randomize the direction every time the ball resets back to the center. So for that first of all at the very top of the code, type from random import choice. And here in the reset ball function, type ball velocity x equals choice, and inside this choice function, pass in a tuple of negative ball speed and ball speed. So now each time the reset ball function is called, the ball randomly chooses the velocity x from this tuple. And duplicate this line. And change x to y, and again these are global variables, so up here in the function, type global, and then ball velocity x and ball velocity y. Run the game. As you can see the ball is picking a random direction when it is resetting back to the center. Lastly, copy these two lines. And when we create the ball replace velocity x and velocity y with the lines of code we copied. Doing this will ensure that the ball moves in a random direction when the game starts, instead of always moving in the same direction. Let's run the game. And let's rerun the game. As you can see the ball picked up a different direction than before. So that's about it. I know there is a lot we can add to this game. Maybe we can add the sound effects and the music. But I think this will do. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and share this video. Until next time.